Hello, everyone. Hello, and welcome to our session today on the in the Azure Cloud Security, the Azure Cloud Security Group meetup. So we have an amazing session for you today. So today we have Lior Zatlavi. So apologies, Lior, if I've mispronounced your name, but I'm sure that you're going to teach me how to pronounce your name if I've mispronounced that. So you have Lior Zatlavi, who is a senior cloud security architect at a company called Emetic, and is going to be speaking to us about addressing the hidden risk of managing IAM in the cloud, and specifically about the Azure clouds today. So we're really excited. This is going to be a really informative session. We're going to be Leo is going to be sharing information with us about why this is really important in terms of looking after the security of our cloud environment. What are the main challenges that we need to be concerned about? And then it's going to show us how to address those. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce to you Leo. So, hello, Leo. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me. And actually, by the way, you pronounced the name very accurately, I
Oh
should say.
wow,
Yeah,
I'm
and
impressed with myself.
yeah, actually more accurately than most Israelis do. Great on that. And thank you so much for the introduction. So again, it's great to be here, and this is of course a very important topic for us specifically as a company, and we really love spreading the word and being hosted on meetups such as this, because we really feel this is a very, very important topic to discuss. And as you said, this is going to be, of course, a very, very informational session about what identity management in Azure looks like, and what kind of controls you have, and what can you do about it. And of course, we're also going to talk about a little bit about our approach and how we see things moving forward, and what's the next generation, what we have to offer. But of course, this is mostly about spreading the word, and mostly about having an educational form, because this is of course the bedrock of good information security, and that being knowledgeable, knowing the risks, knowing the ins and outs, and that's what this is a lot about. So
I'm super excited about that. I'm really I'm really excited. I'm looking forward to it. As Microsoft themselves say these days, they say identity is a new perimeter, right? So it's definitely a very important plane for us to really look after when we're talking about cloud security. So I'll go ahead and hand over to you now, Leah, to carry on with the presentation. So, ladies and gentlemen that are joining, if you have any questions, please do leave them in the chat window, and we're going to read them out, and Leah is going to address that for us. But for right now, I'll hand over to you, Leah. So, over to you.
thank you again, David. So as we said, we're going to start by talking about why is this topic really important, and then we're going to review how access is managed, how access is controlled, and why automation could be the answer to a lot of the gaps and a lot of the cracks that are in today in the challenge of really managing the access. So in order to start about why this is important, we're just going to start with a little example. So this is a vulnerability. This is an article about vulnerabilities that were found last year in Azure Cloud Services. So I'm not going to review the vulnerabilities. It's really interesting of the paper. I really recommend you to read it. But what it actually stated or claimed was that in an app service, which is a service in Azure, there was a vulnerability found, that one of the vulnerabilities that allowed a malicious actor to gain remote code execution if there's SSRF, which is a common vulnerability in web servers. And so it allowed it to escalate its privileges to actually do remote code execution. So for example, let's assume that you have a web application in your environment that is actually vulnerable to that, and a malicious actor can gain access to it. So I'm going to give this example, and of course, all the terms are terms that we're going to review during this session. So don't worry if you don't understand them. So what happens is that web application, in order to access resources within your environment, has an identity or can have an identity called a managed identity. And that managed identity, for example, let's say it needs to access storage that exists within what is called a resource group. So it would be assigned a role called storage blob data reader, and that role will allow the web application to access, let's say, for example, 2 blobs, right? But let's say that for some reason, it could be an error, or it can be something that you did on purpose, but needed to be changed along the way. That assignment was not to a specific resource group, but to a higher level, for example, a management group, right? Which includes a lot of subscriptions, and those subscriptions include a lot of resource groups. We're going to explain that in a second, don't worry. And because of that misconfiguration, what happens is now that web application has access to a lot of blobs, or maybe even all the blobs with your environment. Now, what happens is, if the web application is actually hacked, then the hacker would now have access to a lot more data. Now, the point is, and this is why, again, knowing this topic and putting time in this topic is extremely important, is because, fighting the battle for protecting the web application is important, right? It's sort of a cat and mouse game. There are always new vulnerabilities and new protections and whatnot. But the malicious actors will have their wins, right? They will be able to have their breaches. But it does not mean that the damage needs to be extreme, right? You can mitigate the damage, or you can do a lot to minimize the amount of damage that there is, simply by providing applications, and also providing users, because they can be hacked too, simply by providing them only the access that they actually need, right? If you make mistakes, and these are mistakes that are very, very easy to make. If you make mistakes in assigning permissions, then those mistakes can be dire. Now, and again, if this sounds like far-fetched, it sounds like it's something out of this world, then utilizing something almost exactly like what I just described, but not in Azure, in AWS, is a very, very famous breach. I'm not going to go into it. I don't want to talk about that organization again, but it's a very famous breach from a very large financial organization that was breached in that same way. And the breach had a major fallout, which was not necessary because of that kind of misconfiguration. And it ended up in a fine, which was very, very, very costly. And it only happened, or could say it could have been mitigated only with a little bit more attention to details on assigning configurations or assigning permissions. So this is why this topic is extremely important to understand, and hopefully we're going to do a lot of legwork in understanding that today. So this diagram is a diagram that we use in order to compare Azure to AWS. We're not going to go into it in this session. Why I am presenting this is for two reasons. First of all, this shows you that there's a universal, almost, paradigm for assigning permissions. Assigning permissions would almost always be a connection between identities and permissions and resources, right? So a permission or an assignment would be a connection between an identity, a set of permission that it gets, and a few resources, right? The resources to which it has the access. Now, this is true for Azure, and it's also true for AWS. Now, the other reason why I show this diagram is that if by any chance you are extremely experienced with AWS, you might get confused because of the term role. So the term role exists in both AWS and Azure, but the thing is that it's completely different. So what I would only ask you is to simply forget about the term IAM role if you know it from AWS, because it really does not have an exact equivalence in Azure. That function of assuming a role is not something that you can do in Azure. But if you get hung up about about a role, you might get too confused to understand what it is in Azure. So what I would ask you, if you have experience with AWS, just simply forget about IAM roles just for this session. Also because it's also enough confusing in Azure, because there are several types of roles to actually look into. But we're going to get to that later. So let's get started. Okay, what we actually do during this session is we're exploring the top part of this diagram, right? We're going to explain these components, and then we're also going to explain a lot of other things that will help us understand how access is actually managed. So let's get started. Now, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to start talk about how resources are structured in Azure. And the reason why this is important is because if you structure your resources correctly, then you've won a great deal of the battle. And you've really helped yourself with the bedrock of how you manage access to these resources. So let's explain how it looks in an Azure directory, right, where you manage those resources. So resources are structured within what is logically referred to as containers, right? Not Kubernetes containers, but logical containers that contain the resources. And the way it works is several resources can be grouped together to a resource group. So a resource group is a container that is meant to contain resources that are meant to be either provisioned or deprovisioned together. So usually resources that belong to the same solution. So let's say, for example, I have a web application, and that application would need all sorts of resources like a web server and networking resources and maybe storage or databases. They would all be in one resource group. Now, several resource groups can roll up into what is called a subscription, which is a container meant to manage resource groups that are meant to be built together. Build as in billing. Now, several subscriptions can actually roll up into what is called a management group. And a management group is a container that is meant to contain subscriptions that are used by the same organizational unit within your organization. So they align with the business functions. Several management groups can roll up into a single management group, and all of those until they roll up into what is called the root management group, which contains all of the management groups and all of the subscriptions within your directory. Now, the reason why this is very important to get right, and having the resources in the right resource groups and the right resource groups within the right subscription, et cetera, is because once you apply access to a certain scope, right, and a scope is either a management group or a subscription or a resource group, once you assign access to one of those, let's say I assign access to some identity to access this management group, then the access trickles down to the entire graph below it. So if I make a role assignment, and we're going to get to that in the session, when I make a role assignment, then that role to this management group, it will trickle down to the entire tree below that management group and will give me access to that entirely. So what we saw before, for example, was I meant to give access to the resource group, but I gave access to the management group. So I expanded the kind of access that I have. So this is why it's important to get right? And it's important to get right not just for security reasons, but also for managerial reasons, but of course for our context as well. So how does that look within the console? So in Azure, you have a blade for each type of these containers. So you have a blade for management groups and subscriptions and resource groups, and it sort of looks like this. So in the management groups blade, you can see the management groups, and you can see the kind of structure. So these subscriptions are in the root group, and this management group is below the root group, and et cetera, et cetera. You can also see the subscriptions themselves, and you can see the resource group within each of the subscriptions, right? So that's basically it, right? It's very easy to understand, but it's very important to also get this right and put a lot of emphasis on it. Now, let's move on to the second part of the diagram, and that's the roles. So the roles, as we can see here, are basically the documents that will detail what kind of permissions the identity to which we're going to give access to the scope, which is either the resource or the resource group or the subscription or the management group, what kind of permissions we are actually going to give them. So a role is basically a document, right? We're going to see it in the GUI in just a second, but it's very easy to understand it once you look at it like that. So you can see it's sort of a JSON, right? And the core part of it is, of course, the field of permissions. So it's basically divided into 4 fields, and really it's divided into 2. So we have here actions, which are control plane actions, and data actions, which are data plane actions. Now, this distinction, of course, is important because sometimes we want to allow users to have the ability to manage resources, but not necessarily to gain access to their data. And the other way around, of course, or we want to provide them with access to both. And this is why this distinction is very important to us in order to understand that. So we can see here that we have actions for control plane actions and data actions for data plane actions. Now we also have two other fields called not actions and not data actions, which, as you can understand from the name, are basically exclusions of permissions from what's given using the role. So for example, here we have a different role. We have a different role called contributor. By the way, the role that we saw before is storage blob data reader, which we referred to before. And what we have here is the role contributor, right? So you can see the role contributor has wildcard on all the actions, right? All the control plane actions. But because it's not the role owner, which is a role that has wildcard, and sorry, it's not as permissive as the role owner because it has this list of not actions. And what is listed here is basically excluded from what is listed here. So when we have a role, the role would grant all the actions that are listed here. And in this case, it's all the actions minus the actions that are listed here, which is actually quite a few, given that you have wildcards here. Now, one thing that's important to understand about this is that this is not a deny, right? As information security professionals, when we see a deny, we're very happy because it means that a deny is always higher and it will always take precedent to an allow. But this is not a deny, right? All this means is that these permissions are not granted in the scope of this role, but they can be granted elsewhere. They're simply excluded, right? So it's for convenient reasons that we use it here. So this is an example of how it looks in the document itself, and now we can actually review it in the GUI. So for each scope, for example, here we see a subscription. We have a blade called IAM. Now, in this blade, we manage the roles and the role assignments, which we'll get to later, and we can see all the roles that we can actually apply through which we give access to the identities. Now, there are two types of roles. There are built-in roles, which are roles that are created and managed by Microsoft, and there are custom roles, which we create. So let's go through it, how it looks in the GUI. So when we can look at this contributor role, which we saw before, we saw its document, we can see that we have actions and data actions, which we can choose between. We can see that they are listed, divided by the service, the Azure service or the resource provider to which they apply. And we can also look for a specific service if we care about what kind of permissions are granted using this role. And we can choose to filter based on the type of action, which is also very, very handy. And we can see here, for example, that the contributor can do this control plane action, but it's supposedly can't do any kind of data action. By the way, if we'll have time, I'll show you a caveat as to why it actually can do some data actions. But if we want to see someone that has data actions, we can see that the storage blob data reader has data actions for read, of course, because it can read the data within the blobs. That's what the role is for. Here we can create a custom role, and a custom role can either be created from an existing role that is modified, or completely from scratch. We can choose permissions from the list of resource providers if we want to choose maybe a specific resource provider to which we want to grant roles. And finally, we can also edit the JSON here directly. And we can also see something very interesting here, and that is the assignable scope fields. So the assignable scopes within a role is a limit that we will place on a role when we create it to where it can actually be assigned. Now, this can be a subscription or a resource group. I think that it can also be a management group. I think that's in preview mode now. But the point is that we can choose where we want to allow to assign it, specifically to avoid the kind of mistakes that we saw before. Right? So that's also pretty important for that. Now, moving forward, let's talk a little bit about what kind of identities we have in Azure. So this is the leftmost part of the diagram, and we're going to go over these different boxes. So, of course, Azure, as you may know, Azure Active Directory is, in fact, a directory. It's also an identity provider, and the most basic kind of object, or the most common, I would say, is of course for users, right? For managing objects that are meant to represent the identity of people. Now, they can either be members within your directory, or they can be guests that you invite from outside the directory. And that's kind of pretty. That's pretty simple, right? That you can assign them with access to resources within the environment. Now, another type of identity that you can have, or a type of object to which you can grant permissions, is what is called a group. Now, again, a group very intuitively is an object that can contain a list of users, for example. But a group is a little bit more robust in Azure, and it's actually very important to understand that, because a group can also contain, for example, other groups. So it can be nested. Here, for example, we see an example where the salespeople are also in the product team, right? Let's say I want to manage my organization that way and to provide them with that access. Now, a group can also contain what is called a service principal, which represents entities which are not people. And that's also very interesting. And we're going to dive in deeper just a second to what a service principal is and what kind of service principals there are. But the point I want to make about groups and the importance of why they're so robust, and we're also going to see an example for that later on, is that it's the best practice to assign access not to particular users, or not even to particular service principals, but to create groups to which you assign the actual permissions. And then it's very easy to manage who has access. So this is sort of like an expansion of the idea of role-based access control, because you actually provide a group for each function that needs to be performed, and then you provide that function with the permissions, and then you can choose who you put in and out of the groups, right? That is a very good practice to do it, and that's why this object is extremely important. Now, moving on, we talked about users, which are very basic, but we're also going to talk about the kind of identities that we have for non-human entities. So let's say, for example, I have an application, right? I have some code running somewhere, and I want to provide it with access to resources within my environment. So what I would do is I would register an application, and that application would have what is called a service principal within my environment. So let's see how it looks. So let's say I have an application, I register the application, it creates an object for the application, but that object does not actually get the permissions if I want to grant the application with access to resources. The way it would work is, once I register the application, a different object called a service principal is created, and that service principal is what actually gets the access to the resources. And then the application can use it. Now, why does this happen this way? If you want to understand that, you need to understand that sometimes applications need to run on multiple tenants, or they need access to resources not in just one environment. So for example, our application needs access to the environments of our clients, right? So the way that would work is I would have the home tenant for the application, and then what I would do is I would install the application, or provide it, or the admin of another environment would grant it access to its resources. And what would happen is a service principal would be created for that application within the other environment. Now, it would only have of course, the original application object, but it would have two service principals, right? And a service principal for each environment. And then I can actually provide with access to resources in my environment using that service principal, right? So how that would look in the console is I would register the application. I would choose whether it is for single tenant or multi-tenant, and then I would have the application object, and then I would also have this service principal, which is actually the object that would get the access. Now, let's say I'm not talking about an application. Let's say I'm talking about a resource that wants to get access, whether it could be a virtual machine, or it could be a function, which is Azure's version of a Lambda, or it can be a web application, as we saw before. Now, for that, I would use what is called a managed identity. So let's see how that looks. So let's say sort of like my environment looks like this. I have these resources, and I have these other resources that want to access them. So I have these resource groups and this management group and this subscription, and then I have these web application and this VM and this function app. So what I need to do is I need to use, as we said before, a managed identity. And those are actually split into two kinds. So there's the system assigned managed identity, which is a managed identity that has a one-to-one relationship with a resource. So it's assigned directly to the resource. I can't use it anywhere else. And any assignment that I would give to that identity, to that managed identity, would of course be accessible to the resource. So for example, in this case, if I grant the managed identity access to these resources, then the web application would be able to use them, right? It's a one-to-one relationship if I just needed to do that. But what if I need to create a function that needs to be used in several resources, right? So I have several resources that do the same job, and they need access to the same resources to perform the same kind of functions. So the way that would work is I would create what is called a user-assigned managed identity. And I would create these managed identities separately of the resources. And usually I would do it based on the functions that they need to perform. So let's say I have a processing machine and report generator and image analyzer. And then I would choose what kind of access these identities have to resources within my environment, right? So each would have a different set of assignments. Now, then I can choose where I want to assign these identities. So to which resources would get access to which resources, right? The source and the destination here are both resources, so it might be a little confusing. So let's say I want this web application to be a processing machine, so it would have access to these resources, right? And here I can also apply this report generator identity to several resources, and they can all use it at the same time. Now, how this would look in the console. So when I look at a resource, let's say I'm looking at a virtual machine here. You can see it here. It's a virtual machine. There's an identity blade. So in the identity blade, I can actually choose whether I want to assign it a system identity, a system assigned managed identity, and then that would be created, and then I can apply, I can assign roles to it. Or if I want, I can manage user assigned managed identities elsewhere, and then I can assign them to resources in the user assigned managed identity tab. So I would go to the identity blade and then to the user assigned tab and then apply it from there. Now, we actually talked about all of the components within this diagram, except for possibly the most important one, which we're going to talk about now, because now it will actually bring this entire thing together. Right? We talked about the scope, we talked about the roles, which are the permissions that are going to be applied, and we talked about the various kinds of identities that there are. So how does this all come together? So let's say I have a scope, right? Let's say I have a subscription to which I want to provide access to a certain identity. The way I would do it is I would go to the subscription, and then I would go to the IAM blade, we saw before, and I would add what is called a role assignment. A role assignment is that triple. It's the combination between the scope that I'm on and the role that I'm going to choose and the identity that's going to get the access. The way it would look is like this. I would see the role. I would be able to choose the role, for example, the role contributor that we saw before. I would be able to choose the identity. For example, here I would choose the group. And once I do that and I save, when I select the identity and I save, I actually created a role assignment, and I provided the group and the entities within the group with the contributor role on the org1 subscription 1 subscription. I created this triple. Now I can look at all the triples that are created and are applied to the subscription from the role assignments tab. You can see them right here. Now the interesting part, you can see it here, right? So the interesting part here is that, as you remember, when I assign to a higher level, when I assign a role to a higher level, it trickles down to the entire graph below it. So when I look at a certain subscription, for example, I can also see the role assignments that are relevant to, let's say, for example, the management group above it, right? So here, for example, super admin got the owner role from the management group that contains the subscription, but Sivan got the owner role applied directly to the subscription, right? If you understand the difference. Now, you can also look at it in a reversed way. So let's say I go to a user and I can look at all the role assignments that are applied to that specific user. So here, for example, I have Aiden Emerson, and I can see the roles that it has on the resources, and the resource type, whether it's a subscription or a resource group or a specific type of resource, and I can see where it got it from. So let's say, for example, it's assigned to the group that it belongs to. So Aiden belongs to the group developers, and the role assignment is actually assigned to it, right? So that's basically how you do RBAC. That's the main mechanism. There's another mechanism that we're going to mention, but that's the main mechanism through which access is actually granted. Now, what can you do to manage some of the risk that there is in granting permission to those resources? So the first thing you can do is you can restrict some of the access using some, I would call them deny mechanisms. So Azure provides you with two mechanisms through which you can globally restrict access to resources. Now, they're pretty straightforward, especially if you know AWS and you know the deny assignments from AWS and conditions and whatnot. They're very, very straightforward. And so, for example, we have what is called a lock. A lock is a control that we can add on a resource that can either make it read-only or delete. So it would be globally blocked for other types of actions once we apply it. Now, we can apply the lock directly on the resource itself, or of course, we can apply the lock to a resource group or to a subscription. And we can see in a subscription, for example, all the locks that are currently active in resources within it. Now, another mechanism that we have for making this kind of control is what is called a deny assignment. Now, a deny assignment cannot be manually created yet. It's kind of a frustration when you work with Azure, I would say that. But it can still be created in one or two ways that we're going to show one of, and that is, for example, using a blueprint. So a blueprint in Azure is a recipe for provisioning resources. So if you have, let's say, a resource or a set of resources that you want to provision more than once, then you would create a blueprint for it. And once you do what is called assigning a blueprint, which is actually triggering the creation of the resources, then what you can do then is you can make what is called a lock assignment, which does not use locks that we saw before, but it uses a deny assignment, which we'll now see. But once you provision the resources, you can either decide that the resources are read-only or do not delete. And then when they're created, they will be created with deny assignments, right? Which again, for now at least, you cannot manually create or edit. So, or as you can see, deny assignments are currently read-only. So these deny assignments will actually block all principals from doing certain actions. So this is one way of controlling the access, which is very good for sensitive resources. Now, another mechanism, which is very important, is what's called privileged identity management. Now, privileged identity management is great for all types of resources that have really sensitive or really privileged access, because it allows you to grant this access with great controls in the dimensions of time and also in a just-in-time way. So I mentioned before there's another type of resources, or sorry, there's another type of roles and another type of way to grant access, and that is what is called an AD role. So the roles that we talked about before, and again, this is where the confusion starts. So the types of roles that we talked about before are what are called resource roles. Now, there's another type of role called Azure AD roles. Azure AD roles are roles that are used in order to manage the directory itself. So for example, I would have a global administrator role on the tenant, and I would be able to manage it using that. I would not get it using RBAC. And as the other types of roles, you can also create custom roles, custom AD roles. And when you do that, you can actually see the type of actions that these kinds of roles allow. But the way to understand it is basically they're roles to manage the tenant themselves. So for example, if you want to manage applications, or if you want to get a certain subset of rules, a certain subset of actions that you can do on the tenant, then you have a lot of what are called AD roles. Now, the reason why I'm saying this, is because a lot of the privileged roles that we want to manage are basically AD roles, right? So when we grant access to AD roles or to RBAC or to groups, as we'll see in a minute, we can do that using PIM. So the way PIM works is that when I want to grant an entity access to one of these kinds of instruments, what would happen is I would be able to grant it, let's say, the access to the role, and then I would choose its type, all the configuration that's needed, and then before I sign it, I can actually say whether it's eligible or active, which we will explain in a minute, and whether it's permanent or it's for a specific set of time, which is a very, very powerful control, because what happens a lot of time is that you give access and then you just simply forget about it, or the person leaves and then it's just there for forever. But so the time scope, of course, is a very, very important control, but also the eligible or active. What eligible or active means is whether the access is actually active, so the entity, the person or the machine can actually use it. This only applies to people. So whether the person can actually use it, or it's just eligible to have it. And what does it mean when it's just eligible? So when it's just eligible, right, it's not an active assignment, what would happen then, this is the person's point of view, the person would have to go to the role, right? You see here, these are eligible assignments, and he would have to choose the role and activate it, right? So he does not have continuous access to it. Whenever it needs to use it, the person needs to go and activate the role, right? So when he activates it, we can also configure that it needs to put a justification, and we can also configure that someone needs to approve it, and what's the flow exactly. And of course, there's a time limit, right? So even the person can choose the time limit when there's a certain maximum, and then the session only lasts for that certain period of time. And after that, the activation is gone, and the role is again just eligible. And if the person needs to use it again, he would need to access it again. Now, of course, you understand why this is a very important mechanism when we want to protect certain users and certain roles that they have access to. Now, of course, we can configure the kind of roles that there are. Each role, we can configure how PIM interacts with it. And the last thing about PIM is that we can actually do the same kind of things with groups. This is a relatively new feature. It's still in preview mode. But what this does is it allows us to create groups that the groups themselves can be assigned with AD roles. And then what we can do is we can also manage and assign the membership of the group using PIM. So the way this would work is when I create a group, I check the Azure AD roles can be assigned to it. Again, this is a new feature. And then when I create the group, what I can do is I can assign roles to it, again, either active or eligible to a group, right? This is not a person. And when I assign this group to a person using PIM, then what would happen is when that person logs on, he would need to activate his membership within the group, right? So that actually is a very, very powerful tool. And then once he activates the membership within the group, if that group had an eligible assignment and not an active assignment, then in order to actually have that assignment, you would need to activate that as well. So that is another kind of mechanism that allows us to have that control. Now, the final control that I want to talk about, there are actually more controls, but these are like the main ones for controlling access. There are actually more controls which I don't mention now, simply because there's a time constraint. But I think that the important one to know is a tool called Access Review. So Access Review is a pretty nice tool, and what it allows you to do is for every instrument through which access is granted to certain resources. So let's say there's group memberships, right, as we discussed, so you can take a group, and belonging to that group actually means that the members have access to certain resources, right? And also AD roles and many instruments. We have the list in the end. So because it's very important to review, right, who has access to those instruments, what Access Review allows us to do is to set a procedure through which people within the organization can review if the access is still needed. So what it would do is it can compel people within the organization. It can be distributed, right? So it doesn't have to be the CISO or an analyst from the security team. It can actually be distributed to either the person himself to review whether he needs the access or not, or his manager, for example, or a specific reviewer for a specific access review. And what this would do is it can be either one-time or recurring event for reviewing whether the access is actually needed, right? So the way it would work is in the context which I want to review, I would go and I would create a new access review. I would choose, for example, let's say a group, right? I want to review the group membership access, if the people in the group still actually need to be within the group. And then I can configure when I want to do it. So, for example, I want it to be done monthly on certain groups. And of course, I can choose who does it. So it can be, for example, for a group, it can be the group owner, it could be the manager of the users, it can be selected users, or groups. Or as we see, a user can review their own access, and then I can create it, and I can see the members of the group when I do the review, and then I can choose whether to approve their membership or deny it, and that is the way I can actually manage it. I also get recommendations. So, for example, on users, I would see whether their last sign-in was more than 30 days ago, which would give me sort of kind of like a hint whether I need what I need to do. But the point is that it's really a good tool in order to compel the organization into having this kind of, usually the frequent review. And of course, you can do it for multiple types of instruments. And it's a very good tool. It's not very, I would say, it's not very intelligent, right? But it is something that can put a very important procedure into play within your organization in order to manage the access. Now, the final thing that I want to talk about is vulnerable identities. So vulnerable identities, as we said before, that that you have in your organization. So, for example, internet-facing machines or services, or users that don't have MFA, right? That you choose not to give them MFA for your reasons, or third parties, right? Applications, or guest users within your environment. These are extremely vulnerable, right? So because these can be hacked and you might not know about it, and of course you want to give them special kind of attention. And these are just, of course, a few examples. So the takeaway before we go into what are the current gaps and what's our approach is that if to summarize, we talked about structuring the resources correctly and using custom roles to specifically choose what kind of actions you want to give. We talked about using groups in order to assign roles. We talked about some the restrictions that we have, using PIM, using access review, and of course paying careful attention to vulnerable identities. Now, before I go to questions, I just want to talk a little bit about what is the case for using actually automated analysis on top of what the vendor gives us. And of course, there are other tools which I didn't mention. I just because of time constraints. But what I'm going to say now, of course, applies to those as well. So the problem that we saw, at least today, and this is what brought our approach, is that the native tools that there are today that are provided by the vendors, this is not just specific for Azure, they're not granular enough. So they don't look at things usually in the resource level or even at the action level. So they don't give you like the greatest kind of insight and recommendations as to what would constitute an excessive permission, right? A permission that is not usually used. And they don't give you the full picture, right, out of the box, right? So they don't give you that toxic combination. So if there is a publicly accessible machine that also has access, you would actually need to go over and look at the configurations and deduct that from that in order to understand that such a combination exists within your environment. Now, the environments, of course, are extremely dynamic. They change all the time. A lot of people are involved in managing them. Resources are added. People change their jobs. Things change all the time, and you constantly need to review it. Now, the people who review it, of course, security analysts and people who understand this kind of profession, they would need to invest a lot of time, and they have, of course, a very expensive skill set, and they would need to have a lot of discipline. And also there needs to be a lot of discipline within your organization in order to really perform these kinds of procedures very, very well and very frequently. And that is very costly, right, in order to do that. And as we said, a lot of people today don't even know the problem, right? We still usually focus a lot about what happens, to prevent breaches. But we don't really think about, if the breach happens, how do we mitigate or minimize the kind of access that the malicious actor would have? So this is why there's a very, very big problem. And of course, we didn't mention what happens when there's a multi-cloud environment and how you get, proficient with all the types of environments. So really, our approach to this was to create a solution that constantly reviews configurations and entitlements, and also looks at activity logs from what actually happens within your environment. And then it can actually provide you with scale. You can look at things that go across the board with your environment all the time. And it does so in a continuous manner, right? It does so automatically. It always looks and sees if things changes, and it can provide you with a really clear picture that is also contextual. So you can understand if, for example, you have an excessive permission that is not necessary, you can understand if that excessive permission is for an entity which is also vulnerable. So for example, if it's for a public machine. And finally, because it looks at the logs and it looks at the configurations at a very granular level, then you can get a very, very clear picture in a very, very high resolution, and you can really strive to have least privilege within your organization. And just to give you a taste, if you want to get more information about the product, of course you can reach out. I'd love to set that up. So this is how it looks. So we manage. We can, for example, manage information coming from both AWS accounts and Azure subscriptions. So it's completely multi-cloud. We give you a nice dashboard of the entire identities that you have and which ones of them have excessive permissions. You can look at what we call the identity intelligence. So we show you a list of all the identities, both coming from Azure and from AWS, and you can get, and this is where you can get the contextual information, right? So you understand if there's a risk, and then you can go look deeper into that. And you can see whether the identity, for example, has admin privileges, or it's a third party, or if it's internet facing, or if it's a user that does not have MFA on it. And it really draws you the entire full picture and shows you, for example, if there are excessive permissions, what kind. So this is the excessive permissions dashboard. You can look at what is overprivileged or what is inactive. for users or for service identities, which are used for non-human entities. You can also filter this. So let's say, for example, you only want to look at identities which represent public machines. You can do that, and then you can see that they have risk on it, and you can do a little bit of a deeper dive. And finally, if you look at a certain risk that is presented to you, so let's say, for example, we see this overprivileged managed identity, which is used for this machine, we can see exactly why it's overprivileged. So, for example, we have this machine, right, this VM that uses this managed identity that has this role called key vault administrator that provides access to this key vault. And we see that it's overprivileged, right? It's not being used. So we don't only tell you, look, this is excessive. What we also do is we provide you with remediation steps. So we can tell you, look, this is not used, right? So instead of having it as, this is not used for doing write functions. So instead of doing that, what you can do is you can replace it with a different kind of role, which would be better fitting to what it's actually used for. So in case there's a breach, in case the machine is breached, then excessive permissions are simply not needed to be there and make the breach that much worse. And finally, we also give you a nice look at other posture issues that you can have with your environment in order to, of course, adhere to some compliance standards. And this can also be correlated with the information about the excessive permissions that we have in your environment. And you can also deduct from it where you need to be and where you need to set your attention to. So that's pretty much it. That's pretty much what the way we see the problem set, right? So this is obviously we invest a lot of time in it. We believe this is a very, very important issue to really get to know, right? To have a lot of information about and to manage correctly in order to reduce the amount of damage that can happen from breaches and even prevent breaches prevent certain breaches from occurring. So that's the presentation. I'd love to take some questions, David, if there are any.
Oh, hello. That was awesome, Lior. Thanks very, very much for sharing that information with us. That's like a quick deep dive on, on Azure IAM, on Azure Access, and the different capabilities of the
It's
platform. Yeah,
it's a
that
crash
was
course. Yeah, it's
yeah. It's
and again, it's not even discussing everything, of course, but I do hope that this gives like a nice picture, and if someone wants to do a deeper dive into something, then it gives the platform.
yeah. And also, what I'll do is I'll also get Lior's Twitter account, and I'll put that in the chat window for people to connect with you if they do have follow up questions on that. So we do have a question that came in from Eman, and Eman asked a question. It says, with an identity, people and non-people having a lot of permission combination and scope levels. So essentially, which is the challenge that you were describing earlier. So Eman's question is there a way within Azure to pick one identity and show its true effective permissions?
Yeah. So when you go into the portal, right, and you choose a certain identity, right? I think that I think I had a slide on that. Just a second, I'll look for it. So when you look at a certain identity, hold on, I'll find it. Okay. So here we go. So when you look at a certain identity, right, you can choose, for example, the subscription for which you are interested to see what are the effective permissions that it has, right? So in this case, this is a user, and you can see the kind of role assignments that there are for this user. So for example, this user, Aiden Emerson, has these kinds of permissions. Now, of course, you need to check for, in every context when you do something like this, you need to check whether, of course, this in fact gives you the full picture. But Azure does have great tools to do that. Also, as we saw before, you can also ask the reverse question of when you look at a certain scope, you can see what are the effective role assignments on that, right? But I would say that generally this is a very hard thing to solve. And this is another thing that we solve within a product, and give you like a full picture. If you choose a certain identity, you can see everything that you can do in it. And if you choose a resource, you can see all the identities that can access it and what they can do, et cetera, et cetera.
Awesome. And to the challenge that you just described, which is also to Eman's question, is that doesn't even like really give like the true context of what you're trying to solve there, right? You have sort of like a list of, okay, this user is assigned role at these different levels, but what exactly does that mean? Right? Does that mean that the user has access to some sensitive database over there? You don't really have all those other contexts that's provided to say that information. And to your point, it also doesn't show information around like the privilege level. Is it overprivileged or not overprivileged?
That is absolutely right. It does not show because it does not do that kind of analysis. So it would not, for example, it does not go and look at the logs and see if the user actually uses what access the user has, right? That is exactly why we have our product. We go to the logs and we see what the entity does, and then we can deduct that conclusion, right? So this is why we believe this is the next generation of how you actually manage the current access and reduce it to the level that is actually needed.
Awesome. So Ibrahima has a question here, so I'm just going to go ahead and read that. So Ibrahima said, do we have some comparison in terms of feature between Emetic and other IAM security products? Is the question that Ibrahima asked.
Well, it's a very broad question, and if it possibly could be more specific. But I think that it's if Ibrahim wants to connect with us after, we would love to provide more information as much as we can.
Yeah.
But again, it's a very broad question because there are various types of comparison that we can make.
Okay, Ibrahim, so in case you have maybe any product or any particular thing in mind, if you can share that, that'll be good. So there's another question that came in from James, and James' question is, to clarify, PIM applied to groups. Each member still needs to activate, right? It does not activate all members in the group, like group owner approves, for example. So when so I guess the question is around if PIM is applied to groups, people still need to go ahead, still need to go through the activation process versus automatic activation.
So it's a very good question for clarification, because it's not necessarily that you need to activate. You need to activate eligible assignments. So if an assignment, and this is the distinction that is very important to make when you talk about PIM. So when you make an assignment that is eligible, I'll look for it just a second. No, it's here, right? So when you make an assignment that is eligible, that means that the assignment is not currently active. Now, there are two phases, right? And again, first of all, it's important to understand that the application of PIM to groups is, again, it's a new feature. It's called privileged access groups. That's its name. I can show you here. So here, this is the current dashboard for PIM. So you can see here privileged access groups. And again, it's a new feature. So in order to actually use it on a group, you need to make the group be able to have Azure role, AD roles assigned to it. And then once you do that, and it's a privileged access group, then you can of course make assignments to it which are either eligible or active. And to the question again, when it's active, then it's active. Then it's just like you placed then it's active. You don't need to activate it, right? It's not eligible. And again, this is the difference. When it's eligible, when it's just an eligible assignment. So here, for example, let's do a little bit of a deeper dive here. So for this tier 0 admins group, there is an active assignment of the application developer role. And there is an eligible assignment for the DevOps administrator role. right? So I say the DevOps administrator is more sensitive. I just want it to be eligible, and then someone would actually have to activate it. Now, when I assign this is for me, right? There are two steps of activating here. The first thing that I would activate is I would activate my membership within the group. So my membership within the group is also eligible, not active. It can be active, but here what I show is that my membership within the group is just eligible. When I activate it, then I get the roles. And for example, the DevOps administrator role, the more sensitive role, I just got it as eligible, right? So now I need to activate the role as well. So that's the two steps. I first need to activate my membership within the group, which is not constant. It's I just made it eligible. Again, I can make it active, and then it would be constant. And once I have my membership within the group, I get the eligible assignment to the DevOps administrator role, and then I can activate that assignment to make it active. And then I can finally have it. I can finally have the access to the 80 role, right? So that's the I think that's the new part about using groups, because it makes these kinds of groups are more powerful, because you can actually assign several roles to a single group and then assign that group to a person. That is the I think that is the innovation that is presented within this tool.
Awesome. Awesome. And final question for today. So it's a question that's come in from Aman. And the question is, can Emetic inversely look at data containers in Azure, structured and non-structured, and show what identities people and non-people can access it? I guess the question is referring to the reverse of that. The initial question was, can we look from the user or service principal perspective to see what they have access to, or can we look at the resource and say, show me who has access to this resource?
So yes, so to both direction. I'm not sure I understood the question exactly, but I'll answer it, and possibly it will give the right answer. So to both directions, Hermetic provides the solution for that. So if you want to understand for a specific entity to what it can access, you can get it using Hermetic. If you want to understand the other way around, you can also get it. If you have a resource and you want to understand who can access it and what it can do, you can also use it. You can also use Hermetic to do that. And of course, the really cutting edge solution that you have is that we look at the activity log, and based on the activity log, we analyze the permissions. And we don't only tell you what exists, we tell you what needs to what needs to still remain, which is the least privilege of the access that needs to actually exist. And then we provide you with a step-by-step remediation guide as to how to do it. And it's actually a remediation wizard. So it takes you step-by-step into solving excessive permissions problems that you have in your current environment.
Awesome. Thanks very much for that, Lior. That was amazing. Thanks very much for really sharing this information with us. I really appreciate that. So, and again, thanks to everyone that also taken the time to really join us. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us. So that'll be the end of our Hangouts today. So next time, so we are actually planning another Hangout for next week. So it's sort of like an interesting one, because we had a speaker available, and they'll be talking about threat detection in Azure. So we're looking to do that same time next week on Wednesday. And then the next one that we have maybe like in 2 weeks or 3 weeks time. So, but really appreciate it, Lior. That was very informative. Again, that was a strong crash course in Azure IAM and amazing capabilities in Emetic also. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining us, and see you all later. Have a lovely day, afternoon, evening, night. So have a good night also, Lior. See you. Bye-bye, everyone.